Is the New Orleans Sheriff Susan Hutson to blame for the escape that just took place last month involving 10 prisoners who broke out of the Orleans Parish Justice Center? Well, a scathing new report that has just come out may possibly point the finger directly at her and also outline potentially one of the biggest reasons why this escape took place in the first place. And uncovering this massive revelation may potentially be pretty shocking to each and every one of you, as it certainly was to me. As a person who spent most of my life up until the age of 32 years old in and out of jails and prisons, I had never before in the past been housed at a correctional facility of any kind that didn't have the one particular thing that the Orleans Parish Justice Center didn't have. And the story I'm getting ready to share with you is going to outline exactly what that was. Headline that reads, "The Orleans Parish Jail abandoned its high security unit. Years of violence and trouble followed." When I first ran across this headline, the first thought that came to mind was, isn't there another jail in New Orleans that is shut down and abandoned? And I was thinking that's what they were talking about in this story. I remember from all of the reporting that I've done since this escape took place back on May the 16th, involving the 10 individuals that would break out of this Orleans Parish Justice Center, 2 of which who still remain on the run and who have essentially gotten away at this point. But I remember this one particular thing that kind of went in one ear and out the other, where a story had mentioned where the Orleans Parish Justice Center did not have the capability really to house maximum security prisoners. And that's all that was mentioned in that story. I didn't really know what they were talking about. Again, my mind went back to the abandoned jail that was shut down. I remember videos being shared with me from 10 years ago showing how crazy the conditions were in that particular institution, where prisoners actually had real live firearms inside of the cell blocks, amongst numerous drugs and all sorts. I mean, it was like the streets inside that particular jail. But again, going back to that one story that I ran across and that information kind of going in one ear and out the other in relation to the Orleans Parish Justice Center not really having the capacity or capability to house maximum security prisoners at that particular time, I didn't really know what they were talking about. However, this particular story is going to share with you some absolutely shocking information. Starting off first talking about Linton Van Beern, one of the prisoners who escaped back on May the 16th, who has since been apprehended, and we learned quite a bit more about his past. And he certainly wasn't any type of an honorary prisoner. During his long stay at the Orleans Parish lockup and before his escape last month, detainee Linton Van Beern had racked up criminal charges in 6 cases for jail violations in less than 2 years. Criminal charges? We're talking about shit that you're doing inside of the jail. Infractions, things that would be an institutional charge, a minor, a major. In the state of Virginia, those are referred to as a class 200, which is a minor, and a class 100 infraction, which is a major. But what Van Beern was doing up in the jail was so egregious, he was racking up street charges prior to his escape. 6 different cases. As recently as mid-January, Van Beern was charged with battery against a correctional officer, his 3rd such case since September. They don't got a 3-strike law down there in New Orleans. Maybe they do. Maybe that's why he escaped. But he had 3 assault on a correctional officer charges that he racked up along with whatever he was already sitting in jail for. He certainly had a reason to try to get out. But why wasn't this guy moved? Put in some sort of a segregation in the hole? Well, folks, the Orleans Parish Justice Center did not have secretary housing, disciplinary housing, a hole, a shoe. And the reason why they didn't have anything like this is because Sheriff Susan Hutson abolished segregative housing immediately after becoming sheriff, as this story is going to share with you. So like I had first mentioned, is it Sheriff Susan Hutson's fault that this escape took place? You be the judge. In many jails, Van Beern's record would have qualified him for stricter supervision in a more secure tier, a process known as segregation that's so common the American Correctional Association issues guidelines for it. Oh yeah. There's been a lot of changes to segregative housing. I know of people through the many years of doing After Prison Show and working with and interviewing so many people here on this channel. I've interviewed people who have been in isolation for 10 plus years, enough to make you absolutely lose your mind. There have been laws that have been imposed where you can't keep a person in segregative housing for longer than X amount of time and other things as well. Down in New Orleans, the sheriff came on board and just said, look, we're going to get rid of it altogether. But the New Orleans jail abandoned the practice years ago, shortly after Sheriff Susan Hutson took office in May of 2022. Federal monitors flagged that decision shortly afterwards and have continued to describe it as a critical misstep, one that spawned a subset of detainees who repeatedly do not follow the rules of OJC. Among them, more than half the detainees who brazenly escaped the jail last month who had recent disciplinary problems or had previously escaped correctional facilities. And what did they do? What did the sheriff decide was best practice for these guys who kept getting into trouble because we don't have segregative housing or isolation? We're going to just keep them all in the same cell block together where they're certainly going to get along because they've got one common denominator in common. They're not going to follow the rules of the jail. Let's keep them on the first floor as well. That really sounds like a recipe for disaster. It is of concern that the practice of limiting the movement of high security inmates and the practice of placing them in specialty housing was eliminated, monitors wrote in their most recent report, which came 11 days after the May 16th escape. Hudson's correctional chief, J. Mallet, said the agency is now working to reopen its segregation unit and to add a second one. The jail's so bad they need 2 shoes. Totaling 120 beds, typically enough for roughly 10% of the jail's population, that tier is scheduled to open in mid-July. Throughout Hudson's first term, Orleans Parish Sheriff's Office has dealt with some of the most problematic detainees another way by transferring them to be held pretrial at state prisons. Man, if you were transferring certain prisoners who were problematic to the state prison like Angola pretrial, I'd hate to see how bad they were, given how bad the guys who escaped seem to be. And look at Linton Van Beern, for example, just what they've shared about him thus far. Before he broke out, going back to Van Beurren, 27 years old, and 5 of the other escapees who previously faced criminal charges for jail violations remained among the jail's general population on the first floor. 2 of them had previously escaped from other correctional institutions. 8 of the 10 escapees have been recaptured, including Van Beurren, who's now being held at Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola, but the state's manhunt for the remaining 2 has now gone on for more than a month. Escapees previously found guilty of infractions did spend time in a temporary disciplinary pod at the Orleans Justice Center, though they were likely brief stints for as little as 5 days. OPSO declined to release other information on the escapees' disciplinary histories or records tracking where they've been housed in the jail pending several probes of the escape. Well, I'm sure that information is going to come out eventually, and it's going to showcase probably a lengthy track record of infractions where nothing was done about it. Basically giving these guys the green light to do whatever they wanted to do. No shit, they threatened the maintenance worker that they were going to stab him if he didn't cut off the water. They were used to getting their way anyways. Nothing was going to happen. You know, when you give an inch and they take a mile, how that saying goes, that's exactly what happened in this particular case. These guys felt like nothing was going to happen and that they would get away with it. This jail was a frickin' circus mockery. And it's crazy to think that the abandoned New Orleans jail, which did used to house maximum security prisoners. 10 years ago, there's video on the internet showcasing these dudes running around with pistols in the cell block. Kind of seems like not much has changed, other than potentially the fact that they ain't got no firearms up in the housing unit. Old problems. Last month's jailbreak exploded many of the troubled parish lockups problems into public view. Though the OJC was built as a $145 million facility just a decade ago under a federal judge's watch and part of a decade-old consent decree, OPSO has struggled to safely house its highest risk and special needs population from day one. Some contend it's partly because of its design. 24 housing units, 60 beds per unit, almost all of them designed for 2 detainees per cell. But that doesn't really matter. Just because you've got 2 bunks in a cell doesn't necessarily mean you got to have 2 prisoners in a cell. But if you are dealing with overcrowding issues in the jail, you're going to have that. The fact that they did not have an isolation, a segregated housing unit, is unbelievable to me. I have never heard of a jail that doesn't have that. I've never heard of a sheriff that abolishes the practice of that. There are times when prisoners need to get locked up underneath of the jail. And I know that sounds crazy coming from me, a guy that spent much of his life incarcerated. There were times when I needed to be locked up under the jail, meaning put in the shoe, and I was. If you don't have a way and a means to discipline these dudes, man, they're going to run amok up inside your institution. You know what they're going to do? They're going to threaten a maintenance worker that they're going to stab him if he doesn't cut off the water. They're going to use a pair of hair trimmers to cut through cast iron pipes and concrete block walls, remove a toilet sink combination unit from the wall, just like they did in that TV show Prison Break, and 10 prisoners are going to break out. Oh shit, that actually just happened last month. Jail hired consultants in 2014 recommended OPSO remodel parts of the lockup into smaller units, with some of them putting 1 man to a cell, court documents show. That setup would be more suitable for severely mentally ill detainees, people in protective custody, juveniles charged as adults, or detainees who require segregation. The proposed changes never happened. And just as Hutson's administration abandoned the segregation unit, they were hobbled by other circumstances. She repeatedly requested and had been denied for more money from the New Orleans City Council to boost her badly understaffed department. City Council members have said in the past that Hutson had not provided enough details about how she planned to use the additional money. But the Louisiana Legislative Auditor said recently that Hutson could tap into $8 million in reserves for jail repairs. A lot of back and forth about money. And I'm not going to blame the sheriff for the fact that she wasn't given the money that she needed to get additional staff. If she was going and asking for money and that was getting denied, that can't be her fault. But to abandon segregated housing, oh, that's absolutely her fault. And she knows it too. So much, in fact, she tried to say that she did not do it. As to why the Orleans Parish Sheriff's Office closed its segregation unit just after Hutson took office over former longtime Sheriff Marlon Gooseman, officials gave varying accounts. Hutson office said the decision was made by the jail's warden at the time, Astrid Bergden, an Australian psychologist. Bergden denied the allegation in an email. When I arrived 2 weeks after Hutson was commenced, there was no administrative segregation unit, Bergden said. Gooseman, in an interview, said he always maintained a segregation unit. Again, he was the previous sheriff. Bergden was the warden. Hutson is the current sheriff. Federal monitors noted the opening of the segregation unit up until 2016 and flagged its closure in a report covering April to September 2022, which coincides with Hutson's first few months in office. Interesting to note, violent crime is down 20% in New Orleans. It's Hutson's jail that shoulders the burdens of the slow churn of criminal cases among the jail's detainees, many of whom can't afford bail. The average length of stay at the jail among the 10 prisoners who escaped, 8 of whom were being held pre-trial, was more than a year. From all of the time that I served, a year or more is pretty much standard practice, especially if you have a big case like a murder case or something that is definitely very serious in nature. So I'm not surprised to hear that these guys were in the jail for over a year. Stories that ring alarms in relation to being held in the jail for too long is Rikers Island. I've heard of situations where prisoners were there for 3 to 5 years without ever even going to court. So down here in New Orleans, you're not doing anything special keeping these guys for longer than a year. But what you're saying is you can't even keep them because 10 of them tried to break out and And they did. The sheriff also fought to oppose the construction of a long-planned 88-bed mental health addition to the jail. She said it's too expensive and unneeded. After years of court delays, that building is expected to open next year. So no matter what this sheriff's saying, nobody's listening to her anyways, is what it seems like, except when she says to shut down segregation. They say the jail does have dedicated tiers for its most severely mentally ill detainees, but others with known security risk or even minor mental health problems often end up housed alongside everyone else. On Pod 1D, where 10 prisoners dislodged the toilet before escaping through a hole in the wall, the population included 20-year-old Kendall Miles. He made headlines after he escaped from the Bridge City Center for Youth in 2022. Before he was charged with carjacking and shooting an uptown man, critically injuring him. Those charges were later dropped after prosecutors missed a deadline to file indictments. Man, New Orleans, y'all basically just need martial law down there. Your sheriff's office and jail is upside down, and it sounds like the prosecutor's office is as well. 6 weeks before Miles escaped from OJC, part of the 10 who escaped, he was charged with battery for a jail fight, which prosecutors dropped at the request of the other party, probably too scared to testify. Also in Pod 1D was Antoine Massie, 32 years old. He had already escaped correction facilities twice, once from a youth center when he was 15, once in Morehouse Parish in 2019. Orleans Parish Sheriff's Office declined to say whether the jail was aware of those prior escapes. Sometimes what goes unsaid speaks the loudest. Massey remains on the run along with 28-year-old convicted murderer Derrick Groves. As for Van Beurren, again going back to this guy, before he ended up on 1D, he had been in and out of the jail's temporary disciplinary unit according to OPSO, while he racked up 6 criminal charges for alleged jail violations between 2024 and 2025. In a November 2024 hearing, OPSO deemed him to be an extreme security risk. Van Beurren's lawyer, Michael Kennedy, stressed in an interview that Van Beurren hasn't been convicted of any of those jail-related charges. District Attorney Jason Williams' office dismissed 4 of the 6 cases, each because the Orleans Parish Sheriff's Office failed to properly document the violation or preserve evidence. These were allegations by a sheriff's department. Brace yourself, folks. They're going to obliterate them with this last statement that has proven repeatedly that it lacks the capability of administering the jail. Damn. They straight up said this sheriff's department can't do nothing when it comes to this jail. Folks, absolute bombshell revelations that have been exposed by this story and report. Susan Hutson, the current sheriff down in New Orleans, closed down the segregated housing unit immediately upon becoming sheriff. Could a major reason why this escape just took place last month is because this jail lacked the capacity to properly house these mega security risks that these 10 guys who broke out last month actually wore. And had these guys been in some sort of shoe-like setting, none of this would have ever happened. Just wanted to bring you this very latest. I find this absolutely shocking, and I'm sure that you did as well. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and a comment on this, letting me know exactly what you think about all that we've shared here. And if you find yourself here on After Prison Show enjoying this content but not yet subscribed, please consider doing so that you never miss an upload from us. It would greatly be appreciated and would go a long ways to helping to support this channel. As always, until next time, enjoy life, the free world. Never take a moment for granted and make the most of every day. Peace!